Okay, let's get started. Now we are discuss about the Poetics by Aristotle, section 30, the detailed critical study. Chapter 1, the Poetics, Introduction. The general plan of the Poetics. Plato was singularly unfortunate in being successed by his one-time pupil Aristotle, who failed to understand his teachers properly. With a habit of mind prone to analyze and classification, he couldn't grab the central doctrine of Plato. With the purpose of replying to Plato and of the setting all right, the nature and function of literature. He began his poetics. The real motive in composing this work is evident in the simple fact that Plato isn't mentioned here even once. Written about the poetics, Lascelles Abercrombie says that, like most everything else of his that has served, it was not composed as a book. It merely represents lecture which he used to give his students. It may be the notes with which some students took of his lectures. It may be mixture of both. Whoever committed it to writing didn't do so for the public to read. It is abrupt, disjoint, awkwardly tears, as awkwardly digressive. Essential ideas are left unexplained, essential things are elaborated. In short, it has all the literary defects of literature notes. Poetics consists of 26 chapters compared in fourth 45 small pages. However, there are grounds for thinking that it is perfect as it stands and that a second book has been lost, which contained in all probability a theory of comedy as well as Aristotle's explanations of the much discussed terms catharsis. It is dividable into the following six parts. Chapter 1 to 4 are introductory to the main treatise, which is a discussion of poetry and its various kinds. Thus, Aristotle begins with some general remarks on art. He deals similarly with the various imitative arts, reveals the psychological motives, and the sketches rapidly the history of the poetry and the evolution of the various forms, including tragedy and comedy. The next 14 chapters VI to XIX are devoted to tragedy. A definition is given and the several formative elements, namely plot, character, and dress, are specific. But the discussion is confined almost wholly to part with one chapter XV on character and two XVII and XVIII, or practical hints for the tragic poet. The next three chapters, XX to XXII, are devoted to poetic diction, though grammatically details are discussed at somewhat inordinate length. Chapter 88111 Details with narrative poetry and tragedy. In chapters XXIV and XXVI, the epic is treated in brief through, though pregnant functions, particularly with regard to its value as compared with that of tragedy. The chapter XXVR reference is made to current problems in the criticism and the principles underlying their solution. It is defects. No one can fail to notice a marked disproportions in Aristotle's handling of his subject. Lyric poetry, for one thing, is practically ignored comedy at the epic or but slightly treated, and while on the other hand the largest part of the discussion is devoted to tragedy. It is upon the nature of plot and the effects of the tragedy that interest is mainly concentrated in thus attaching to tragedy an importance not rewarded by later history. Aristotle was therefore betraying some or of the imitations of his age. The Poetic is written in an asterisk style, in a style that's which was intended for the initiated and for circles already familiar with the author's terminology and thought. The work thus demands from its reader a certain primary knowledge to enable them to supply what is left unsaid or else to interpret with what is said obscurely. His poetic must be read in connection with his politics, ethics, and metaphysics. Apart from the mission second book, the work is obviously not in a form intended from publications by its author, for there are regularity and anomalies which suggest a lack of revisions. There are contradictions, digressions, omissions, and other marks of haste. What these facts suggest is the collection of Aristotle's MS or lectures, note, postals edited by some of his pupils. The character of value of poetics. The poetics is important because directly or indirectly it has command more attention than any other book of literary criticism, but further the work has a parliament value quality apart from historical considerations. Aristotle's fundamental assumptions and the generalized upon which he mainly insists are true of any modern literature as they are of his own. That a work of art, for instance, a drama or the like, may be compared to a living organism, every part of whose structures is dependent upon the function of the whole, is a conception having vivid validity for the ages. And the same may be affirmed formed of his contentions that poetry has its own standard of correctness or fitness and is to be judged primarily by its own laws. The treatise of further valuable for its method and perspective simply and directly. It lays emphasis upon what is of first importance. upon the vital structures of a poem rather than the meters, upon the end and aim of the tragedy in its effect, upon the emotions rather than the history of a chorus, profound thought are expressed in language suited to a scientific and inquiries. The poetic is not only the first truly philosophical discussions of the literature but the foundations of all subsequent discussions. Much of what Aristotle illustrates Greek thought and concern Greek literature, but much of what he says is the essence of light thinking about literature in general. It is moreover significant that Aristotle's attitude without is retrospective in kind. He is merely seeking the law in the fact that lies before him and he makes no pronouncement as to the literature of the future of the furthers. Nevertheless, the miracles of the poetic is that it contains so much that is of permanent and universal interest. And so the work is full of originals idea that are as true today as when they were first formulated, taking into account the Platonic assumptions that a literary form, from example, a tragedy has the nature of a living organism. Aristotle held that each distinct kind of literature must have a definite activity of functions. Against this, great critics was able to find a way to select out of large extent literature a small number of tragedies which must necessarily conform more nearly than the rest of the idea type to his general literary estimates. This enabled him to assign tentative values to one play another. As the poetics, which is based upon research, is among a great number of municipal constitutions, so in the poetics, he conceptions are based upon a number of instances by penetrating to be the proper effect of this kind of literature upon the idea spectators, namely the effect which he terms the catharsis of pity and fears, the purgations of two distributing emotions. In this manner, he arrived at the conception of idea structures for tragedy. Aristotle's methods are exploratory and tentative. It is an attempt to arrive at the truth rather than an assertion of some preconceived nations. It is the first attempt made by men of astounding genius to build up in the region of creative art a rational order like that he had already established in the region of the physical science. Gilbert Murray. Throughout the study poetry in relation to man, he traced it back to the fundamental instinct of human nature, the instinct of imitations and in the instinct of harmony. Thus, his method of inquiry is physiological. It is the first physiological study of the poetic process. The tragedy he justified by its emotion effects. Aristotle's greatness lies is the fact that he raised the essential problems, though he was not always successful in providing solutions. The poetic is thought provoking, it is a great irritant to thought. Aristotle asked the right type of questions, and literary theory has grown and evidence by seeking answer to these questions. Conclusions. However, it is when we considered the method employed and the lines along with Aristotle work that we began to realize the true greatness of the poetics and it works and its echoes making quality. Castings aside the oracles method of earlier philosophers who had depended for their result on a sort of prophet insight, prophesied insight. Aristotle discards also intuitive and dialectic method as a being inadequate and for the proper for the purpose. He starts from concentrate fact and his principles are generalizing based upon those facts. His method is alike analytic, inductive, and scientific in the best sense of the terms. Okay, do like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.